This conference will now be recorded.
And there we are, we're recording. Okay, let's make a start then. So not necessarily to dwell on this too much, we have talked about this previously in terms of the asset being transferred across, and in Q1 of 2020, what we call the core value lines, so the Trevor, Aberdare, Merthyr and the Rumney lines, down to the Bay, were transferred across into Welsh Government and TfW ownership off of Network Rail. So it's pretty much everything there you can see in yellow. Of course, when we talk about the core valley lines, we mustn't necessarily be, it needs to be inclusive of all the other surrounding valleys, but we've got the Maeseg line and of course the Ebbw Vale up to Blaen y Gwent area, but they are still intended to stay in Network Rail ownership because they have more of an interface with the Great Western Main Line and the GWR services which are running along those. So in terms of the assets which we inherited, I'm sure a couple of my colleagues on the phone here certainly know these assets in a lot more detail than what we do, but this is everything which came across. Of particular note is the amount of bridges in a relatively short section of track of 180 kilometres, and having spent quite a bit of time on the Great Western Main Line between Bristol, Newport and Cardiff, where we had about 26 structures to work with. This is a significant increase, hence why we've had to adopt a slightly different type of technology to be able to bring the electrification into use. But you can see across there, there's a lot of different assets, and of course part of the CVL transformation, we're going to be interfacing and dealing with and interfacing with pretty much every single one of those assets. So a bit of a recap about how we're structured. Transport for Wales is an organisation and owned wholly by the Welsh Government, but then underneath that we have our managing agent, which is Amey Infrastructure Wales, but actually recognising that from the off, not one company alone can deliver all of this major infrastructure projects exclusively. We've had to create an alliance, and part of that alliance is called the Craidd Alliance, which is core in Welsh. And as part of those key members are Transport for Wales, headed up by myself, Amey Infrastructure Wales as a managing agent, and then we have our three core IDPs who are working on the patch at the moment, which is Alan Griffiths, Balfour Beatty Rail and Siemens Mobility. So there's our hub. Some of you will recognise it. It opened in January of last year, and we had Mr. Skates come down, which was a fantastic day. But it's a really good opportunity to have everyone, including the infrastructure maintainer, in one building and operating as an inclusive party. However, things haven't been quite as rosy as what you can see there. And no matter than a couple of weeks later from that photo being taken, we had some really significant floodings around February of last year. And I think since that point, we've been flooded about 2 or 3 times now across the core valley lines. But of course, if I was to pluck a positive out of there, some of our track renewals we've been doing so far, we've been implementing some additional drainage. And actually, where some of those assets would have taken sometimes 10 days to 12 days to actually dewater, they've been happening a lot quicker subsequent to some of the works we've been doing. So not only have we been doing some track lowering, it's also doing the drainage works associated to that as well. So what is the core valley lines transformation all about? I've no doubt you would have seen quite a bit of this before, but the key thing for us is the overarching principles of why we're doing this. It's about putting the passengers first and their key priorities foremost. Focus on improving passenger experiences by reducing the journey times, enhancing the public spaces and increasing the service frequency, and we'll touch on a bit more of that, and enabling the new rolling stock to be introduced across the network and beyond. And for those who have travelled on the CVL, some of the really old rolling stock we've had previously, such as the Pacers, they were there, they served a purpose, and they were certainly fit for purpose at the time. But actually the communities in South Wales certainly deserve a lot better, and that's what they're going to be getting. It'd probably be remiss of me not to mention the funding at this point. So it's a large major infrastructure scheme, and it's funded by multiple players. So the original CVL envelope of 738 million was made up by a number of parties. So that's the Cardiff Capital Region, which is a consortium of 10 local authorities, elements from the DfT, Welsh Government and the European Union. And really the last one is of significant note, because 168 million of that is actually funded by the EU. Now, clearly, much like most of the infrastructure projects across the UK over COVID and certainly Brexit, they've had some increases and some delays to what they're delivering at the moment, and we've succumbed to very similar challenges. For those who may not be aware, the European funding is actually linked to certain milestones and certain delivery dates, and we've been working really close with our WEFU and European Union colleagues to try and re-baseline some of those dates to make sure we get to spend all of that money. So in terms of the scope of works, we've got a couple of slides here talking about exactly what's happening. So on the right-hand side, some of you will be familiar with this map. Obviously, we recognise now what all the core value lines are. All the shaded areas in the background are all the local authority areas. So suffice to say, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement and interface required across all of those parties. But in terms of the scope of works itself, you can see there's a certain amount of civils applications and interventions, albeit probably far less as a result of the type of electrification system which we're building, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail. In terms of station improvements, 2 new stations, which I know is not a vast number, but a lot of the existing stations are having extensions put on them in terms of to cater for slightly longer trains, and upgrade facilities across 68 stations altogether. And clearly, as we are creating a brand new network with lots of new systems involved, there's of course electrical power constraints which have to be addressed, and we're building that into the system as we go. Moving on to signalling, I'm not going to read it out per detail there, but suffice to say, the network which we've got there at the moment is past, well, it's on borrowed time, as it were, and it's clearly fit for purpose in its previous state. But in turning, in the sense of increasing the TPH to what we're envisaging, we do need to not only update the overall system, but of course immune it to make sure we can electrify the whole system. And lastly, in terms of the scope of works, you can certainly see quite a few of the track interventions which are happening there, and what we're calling the smart electrification, which is electrifying circa 170 kilometres of the track. And you see there circa 3,000 mass locations, but more importantly, we are implementing around about 60 permanently earth sections. And this is allowing us to, harping back to the civils interventions, cut down the amount of physical bridges, footbridges or road bridges or other fixed structures, which we'd ordinarily have to either rebuild at a higher soffit height or indeed lower the track below. But by applying the PES through those areas, and certainly some catenary free areas, we were able to reduce dramatically the amount of civils interventions. And lastly, the vehicle maintenance facilities. We have a new depot and a signalling centre at Taftswell, and we'll cover that in a bit more detail. But we have significant upgrades at the depots at Canton, Treherbert and Rumney. So we've talked about the type of services which are running, and for those who are less aware of the type of TPH we're running at the moment, so for the heads of the valleys, which we call Treherbert, Abdare and Merthyr, it's currently 2 TPH. We've actually 1 TPH between Bargoed and Rumney. And part of all of these works is about reconnecting those communities and be able to provide a greater frequency. And the next slide will give you an impression of what that looks like. So some of our core central stations, such as Pontypridd, is currently 6 TPH, with Queen Street at 12. But once we've conducted the works and post-transformation, we're looking to achieve 4 TPH to the heads of the valleys. And of course, more importantly, in terms of big demonstrable increases, it would be Rumney, going from 1 TPH to 4. Pontypridd increased to 12 TPH, and Queen Street, which I know is going to be a hell of a task for our colleagues, because it's an exceptionally constrained area in which to work, to get that up to 18 TPH working through that area. When we talk about connecting communities, I was speaking to some drop-in events up in the Rumney Valley, and it really dawned on me quite how much of a difference it really would make for people living in that area. Whereas at the moment, if for whatever reason life happens and you you've been up with the child throughout the night or whatever restrictions and you've missed that train. Actually, if you've got a really not particularly understanding employer and you catch the next train into the centre of Cardiff, you're an hour late, you could potentially lose your job. Or actually having the opportunity to potentially have a service every 15 minutes really is a game changer for people and actually really opens up the connectivity. But more importantly, when you actually look at the type of rolling stock which are becoming into use, and we're going to touch on that in a second, actually they have the opportunity to sit down with Wi-Fi and actually have the opportunity to actually be productive on your train journey, as opposed to being sardined as a lot of people currently are at the moment. So in terms of the type of service which we've got coming in, we've got the class 756, which we call the Stadler Flirt, or the tri-mode. We've got 7 3-car and 17 4-car sets. The tri-mode units itself are powered by 25 kV battery and diesel, albeit the actual battery, the diesel pack isn't a traction power unit. It's almost a bit of a donkey generator to slowly trickle charge the battery. So primarily its use or its traction power use is 25 kV and the battery. And that'll be running full 100% electrical services between Cardiff to Rumney, Corridon, and it'll be using beacons to switch between those modes and through the permanent earth and catenary free sections. Onto the bi-modes, we've got our class 398s, and these will predominantly be running across the Cardiff and Cardiff-based Droherbert, Aberdare and Merthyr lines. And very much the same as the tri-mode, there'll be beacons in track for working through the permanent earth and catenary free sections. And just as a bit of evidence that these things actually are physically being built, despite all the horror stories you hear about rolling stock arriving on time, it actually transpires for the first time ever in rolling stock history that both these sets of trains are likely to actually arrive on time. So I've got to make sure I've got the infrastructure there or thereabouts to be able to receive it. And actually see these are starting to be tested out on the European networks. So clearly the MVs need somewhere to live, and that's where Taffswell Depot comes into its own. So this is effectively where the trains will be stabled up on night time. The Taffswell is a pretty complex area, so as much as it may look quite large, the old Forge Master site for those who may be aware, but it's the new depot is there's circa about £100 million worth of work actually happening there at this time. So as I said, it'll be housing the circa 36 of the new Metro vehicles. All the new train crew will be based out of there, along with the Metro vehicle maintenance staff and some of the staff which are be manning and staffing the integrated control centre, employing another 52 members of staff. That's integrated control centre will be stripping out the overall control of the system out of the Cardiff ROC, which is where it's currently exists at the moment, and moving across into the ICC, so it'll be fully self-sufficient from that point. Just in terms of the top right picture there, there's a lot going on. So not only have we got some significant bridge works to physically access the depot, it's creating a new train path which will be coming off the existing line physically into the depot itself. Building the new rolling stock depot, and of course the wash plants, stabling lines and everything which goes along with it. Building the ICC, as we've said, but also significant highways works and improvements to the Taff Trail to be able to allow all of that to be built in a very constrained area. So for those of a design contemplation, I'm sure you'll appreciate the complexity of this 3D imaging at the moment of some of our really early design work. You can see here at this point that the plan has developed slightly further. If you look at the top left image, you've got 2 tracks which are spinning off to the right hand side underneath the highway. That will be the new access which is actually coming into the depot, whereas the one you can see in the green going underneath Cardiff Road Bridge, actually that's been de-scoped as a bit of value engineering, so that will no longer be built. But you can just see the sheer complexity of not only just building the entrance to get in here, but also trying to limit the amount of closure we have of the highway in and around that area. So a couple of photos just to evidence exactly what's going on. So this is the integrated control center which is being built. So we've got the shell is pretty much completed and the internal fit out has now commenced. We've got Alan Griffiths, which has built that building itself, and we've got Siemens, which are now starting to, or will be ready to start to fit out all of course the telecommunications on the inside of the building. In terms of what else has been going on, there's a significant volume in a really small constrained site. At the moment, we've been waiting on some permissions from RCT in order to be able to physically build a depot. And I'm pleased to say, as of earlier part of last week, those have come through. So we've actually started to pour the concrete for the strip foundations for the actual depot itself. And the depot frame for the building will start to fly up from as early as January of next year. The fourth Blevin works, which is the bridge works, which will enable the entrance into the depot, has already started. And we've got various amounts of piling which have started to work around there. But the actual physical bridge excavation will be starting to commence early part of 22. So I'm really conscious we've touched a lot on what's happening around Taftswell Depot and the surrounding areas, but of course there's been a lot of works which have been happening across the piece. So I've just got a couple of photos on the next few slides which start to talk through a couple of different disciplines which have been going on. So this is what we call our package 4 and package 5 works, which is our line side signalling and telecoms. We have Siemens in the chair for this. And as you can see, they've been going out and doing a lot of significant works in terms of not only signal head replacements, but also starting to build stage platforms and locations. For those who are wondering why we aren't necessarily using like for like and what's been there previously, we're looking at this in the view of clearly climate change isn't necessarily going to get any better, albeit I know globally COP is looking to try and help address that. But if we look at our history to date and the amount of times we've been flooded across the CVL network, it'd be remiss of us not now to try and raise some of the electrical assets off of the ground to try and help get back to an operational railway at the point in which we're getting flooded out. And as you can see here, some of the quality of the works which are going in, we're really pleased with, and we're certainly happy to be supporting Siemens and all the rest of the IDPs to make sure that the asset which we hand over to James and his team at the end of the transformation is entirely fit for purpose and indeed can be maintained and operational. And as you can see, there's some of the earth testing which has been going on for the equipment which has been installed. In terms of OLE, probably not the most sexy of slides, but we've been going out, and for those people who've got lots of experience of OLE, one of the biggest pains we have is getting out of the ground. So we've been undertaking a lot of trial hole excavations to make sure we understand exactly where our stats are. And that's not just our line side rail operational stats, it's also our third party statutory undertakers. And much to our horror, even though we thought we knew where most of the stats are, there's always a couple which will tend to catch us out. And some of the track renewals we've had, even the statutory undertakers themselves didn't necessarily know there were some high pressure water mains stuck in the forefoot. And indeed a number of gas mains, specifically in the Dreherbert and the Aberdare areas. So going out and doing trial holes, as much as we would like to risk assess and do something slightly different, as it would transpire, we pretty much are digging every single mast location. But we're not necessarily digging that by hand. We have been bringing in some VACX equipment. So you can see the top left there, the rail vac, as some of you may have used, and then the Quattro machine in the bottom left there. But a lot of the ground we're using is incredibly hard and consolidated with lots of glacial deposits. So even using VACX technology, it can be really challenging. In terms of the foundations themselves, we've got a number of usual CHS. We've got a number of pad locations where we have constraints of mining activity, and we're working closely with the coal authorities to try and help understand a lot of the mining reports we're getting off of them. And we have a lot of locations, you can see at the top right there, which are pre-augured and then cast in situ concrete augured foundations. And in terms of our Series 2 equipment, we're pleased to see some masts starting to go up. And of course, every now and again, when we start to get some of our blockades, and we'll touch on a bit more on the efficiency of working in blockade and the economies of scale, we'll certainly be looking to get that production line up and running. I would say one of the constraints we have found across the piece is the amount of road rail access points across the network. And some of the lessons we would have picked up from the Great Western Electrification Project is it's really helpful to have a wrap and access location the best part of every 1.5 miles to 2 miles across the route. Now, I thought that was pretty challenging to build that on the Great Western Main Line, but compared to the core valley lines, it's really difficult to get that many wrap locations in. But more so over than that, it's about some of our constraints around working in areas next to major junctions, such as around Rada and the city lines. We do have restrictions on not only just access points, but that's called physically possession access, and we're working through that to see how we can best utilise the access we have got. In some of the Deveg works, again, there is a lot of devegetation going on. Recognising clearly moving from usual network rail standards up to electrification standards, and actually looking at the asset itself, because of the line speeds previously, actually we found there's a lot more devegetation to actually not only just get to usual NR standard, but then go past that point up to electrification. And of course, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement because as much as everyone wants the railway, they don't necessarily want to see it. So a lot of the works we've been doing has had to take a lot of stakeholder engagement to get people on board and to recognise why, for lots of different reasons, we actually need to do the level of invasive works we are. In terms of the track works we've got going on, Balfour Beatty are in the chair for this, and they've been working very hard out on the network. We've got a lot of single line relays, which of course a lot of you all know are exceptionally challenging to do, some of which are steel sleeper relays, and you can see there we've been using the McCullochs to not only strip out but also bring in the those panels and the sleepers back into place. And we've been utilising the PEMLEMs a hell of a lot as well. We've got a number of interventions over the next couple of years. I'd say probably one of our biggest constraints we've got is actually getting reassurance for our actual rail engineering trains via SEO, but I know we're working really close with our network rail colleagues to try and get some more reassurance around those deliveries. But recognising, of course, ordering trains 48 weeks out when we've got a project of this scale, it is always going to be a bit of a challenge, but we do feel we're getting somewhere close now. So hopefully from April of next year, now that we've got all of our bids in, we'll hopefully start to see a more consistent approach in terms of the engineering trains being available and some of the strategic plant which we're using. I would say Balfour Beatty have been trying to exploit lots of different methods of relay. So we haven't purely been relying on engineering trains. They've been using a lot of road transport in order to be able to get ballast to and from locations, and obviously using a lot of dumpers to be able to ferry materials about. So it'd probably be good at this point to highlight, and you would see some of the photos here. We've been relaying existing track in terms of implementing light speed improvements. There's been specifically bottom left a lot of platform works, and again restaging and remeasuring throughout the platforms and making adjustments through there. We've also been reinstating some existing track, but of course with all this, in our wisdom many years ago, and we can all fully understand the reasons why, when we've got rid of a redundant track bed, sometimes assets have been built there, so there's been a lot of relocation of existing assets to be able to reinstate the second line and create loops or passing loops. In terms of blockade working, we've very briefly touched on there's certainly an economy of scale, and we certainly utilise this towards what we call the COVID blockade we had. So it got generated at very short notice towards December of last year, and I think it's from memory about the January the 4th where we broke into a 3-week blockade. And that gives you some high-level quants here of the types of things which we're getting undertaken throughout that three-week period. Now, throughout the next couple of years of transformation, there'll be a whole host of abnormal blockades, possessions, but the one thing we are working more closely with Welsh Government and our stakeholders is actually what could be the economy of scale of having more blockade style working, and we're going to start to work that through. Not only would it offer more reassurance for the end scale in terms of the end date of the programme, but also if we're looking at starting to put bus replacement services on, actually how do we better tackle that? Is there something better we can do to be able to move people around, but at the same time getting large scale swathes of work done, and specifically in the areas which we touched on, which are really quite difficult to get to in terms of access. That's all I had in terms of CVL. However, I did think it might be helpful to touch on, let me just go through these slides in terms of the pipeline of works for what TFW are currently looking at. It's just 2 or 3 slides here, and then we can open the floor up to questions. I can see there's a couple of questions already in there at the moment. So in terms of our pipeline, I thought it'd be probably quite helpful to look at our life cycle process and our governance, and what we refer to in the red line across the top there is our TFW plan of work and how that maps across the Network Rail GRIP process, which of course all of us will be really familiar with, and then how that maps across to the Highways Agency and the Welsh Government key stage approval process. So when we start talking about stage A, that is effectively our GRIP 1 and GRIP 2, and then breaking into stage E, detailed design, and through into stage F, which is effectively going into our GRIP 6 to 8 and into our construction. So in terms of visibility of the pipeline, we're currently working through what we call the Cardiff Central business case around the Metro Central, and this could be anything as large as 130 million investments in and around Cardiff Station itself in the Q2 of next year, and the sort of curtilage and the surrounding areas. There's Wrexham area rail improvements, you can see there. M4 Technical Advisory Group, which is off the back of the Burns report. And again, there's significant work there, which is likely be staged and be working through with Network Rail. And we're currently undertaking a 20-mile-an-hour pilot scheme. So again, we don't purely just look at rail integrated works. We're also doing a lot around bus interchanges and the highways. And then lastly, you can see there in terms of our infrastructure projects, top left, funded or in the pipeline. So we've got the current CVL transformation project, which I've just taken you through, and then a number of other schemes there. Of particular note, Ebervale, we have just entered into a tripartite contract with ourselves, Blaen y Gwent, Welsh Government and Network Rail. And Network Rail are delivering those works on behalf of us all. And reaching out to the supply chain at the moment to actually start to contract those works. And in the right hand side there, you can get an indication of a really high level indicative large scale spend between 2025 and onwards of 2030. That's all I've got in terms of slide pack to share with you today, and I'd welcome any questions you've got. I can see I've gone into the, there we go, we're into the message bar. So first question I see is from Mark. Were the wraps every 1.5 or 2 miles required to enable the early installation of the track relay works? Yeah, it's a really good point actually, Mark. Predominantly it was for the OLE works. What we found, it was more the transient sites or activities such as our signalling, telecoms and OLE, which needed those. What we found are more static sites, actually, such as bridge interventions and things like that. We didn't necessarily need such regular sites. And in terms of facilitate future maintenance works, yeah, of course, so we've been working with our IM team. So out of all of those wraps we're putting in, they won't all stay in. Some of them will come out, but there'll be a vast amount which will stay in, which will be an increase in what's currently there for present day to be able to help with future works. Dan, hi Carl, any news on Deeside Station and Shotton? How are these station contracts likely to be let? Will they be via Stride? Yeah, hiya Dan, good to see you. It's a really good question. Well, Stride, is no longer, in the sense of it won't be going back out to market. What we have recognised and been working with our supply chain team is the amount of effort there is for our supply chain to actually go out and get onto the framework for Stride. We didn't necessarily have a great deal of work in the next couple of years, which would actually really warrant all that effort it takes to get onto the framework. So what we will be doing is going out to open market and open tender, sorry, for each of those works. In terms of D-side and Shotton in particular, so off the top of my head, I think D-side is the AFC for that is anything between 15 and 25 million, depending on the what type of solution we end up with. And Shotton, it's really gone into quite a large scheme. It could be anything between 40 and 50 million. So they're currently penciled in for GRIP 4 works between now and Q1 of next year. We're just waiting to hear on some funding arrangements to see how those schemes are taken forward. But I'm pretty confident both of those schemes will be taken forward. Andrew, could you elaborate a little more on the PE sections and also continually free sections? Yeah, sure. Well, I'm going to be stepping outside my comfort zone a little bit here, Andrew. In terms of the permanently earth sections, they are not necessarily novel in terms of the rail network, but they are relatively novel in terms of Wales. The permanently earth section actually has a catenary wire which runs all the way through, so therefore when the pantograph reaches those areas, there'll be a balize in the track which will switch it from AC onto battery, but the pantograph will stay up in those sections and be able to cruise straight through on battery power, pick up the balize the other side, then switch back over to 25 kV. Whereas, of course, the catenary free sections, the pantograph will actually physically have to drop through those areas. We have got a really, some would say interesting, I'd say a constrained site, in the sense of there are lots of different locations where it is really difficult to be able to install OLE for a number of reasons. I'll use one as a particular example, which is through Craidd. We're doing some really close work with Cardiff University. And what we have found is that they've got some really sensitive equipment which they are building right next to Craidd station. And actually, due to the EMC levels which we could potentially be giving off with electrical system, whether it be a PES or indeed a full 25 kV system, we're unable to install at this time equipment there unless we do some really big EMC screening across there, which I'm sure would look absolutely horrific. It doesn't necessarily mean we won't necessarily have to get to that space, but at the moment we are not planning to run, we'll have a catenary free section through there. But the rub, and of course with all these things, there's always a rub. If you lose battery or kV charging throughout that section, you then have to readdress and look at your battery modelling, and then you look at timetable, you look at passing loops and all these types of things. So whenever we have a particular constraint in one area, we then have to keep going back around the buoy of looking at our battery power, look at our battery modelling, look at the timetable, and then look at are the loops still in the right place. So it's a constant sort of check back on each of those parameters. Hopefully that's answered or expanded on the question a bit, Andrew. Alan, can you please describe the proposed new junction layout immediately south of Cardiff Queen Street Junction or Queen Street Station? I can't off the top of my head. It's a really good question, Alan, and it's certainly something we can come back to, and we can share some details on that. But apologies, I haven't got that to hand right now. Any more questions, folks?
I've got a question. So the permanently earth sections, and you're describing there how you have to obviously it impinges upon the battery performance and indeed the performance of the trains. Is there a risk that you're going to build in permanent constraints to the operation by doing that, as opposed to a continuous electrification? So I can see the benefits from an enormous saving in capital cost, particularly if you were going to avoid reconstructing bridges. And I know from the early days of this project, some of them would have been really major exercises. But do you think there's a risk that it will constrain the development or the potential for timetabling in the future?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Andy. There's probably a couple of ways to go at it. So in terms of the current expectations of what we're looking to do, we do have a constraint we're working through about what's it do, the potential impact of battery life and battery modelling. Because with all these things, we're talking about a technology which isn't necessarily new and novel, but actually, if you look at how long battery technology has been used on trains, in terms of metro style vehicles, we're still pretty early on in our thinking and about what the battery will actually perform like in 5, 6 or 8 years time. So it's the current plan, and again off the top of my head, I think it's 8 years the batteries are due to get swapped out anyway. And clearly at the time of tender, I have no doubt the rolling stock manufacturer would have built in a certain amount of float in the times in the percentages of battery modelling which they are using. What we're trying to get under the skin of at the moment is work out what our comfort levels are of how of what you could actually run the batteries down to. But there's another couple of considerations to be had. One is actually the load on the battery itself in terms of its charge, of its acceleration, the weight of the vehicle at that time, and of course you'll be well aware of the geography in which the vehicle's operating. So there's all of these things which are currently in consideration about what's TfW's and Welsh Government's appetite about how far we push the battery technology, knowing full well that one, it's new to us and we need to be able to learn and understand it. We are taking lessons from the batteries being used in the metro vehicles up in Birmingham, and despite the welding issues which have been happening at the moment, but what we have heard from the battery is that they are outperforming their expectations. But coming back to your part of your point about future extension, for me, it's actually going to be more about double tracking. So what we have at the moment is a operational railway which are on paper and in terms of our timetable modelling and at times of perturbation works, but actually to make something really resilient and to be able to increase it and be able to add more stations in the future, more stops, we need to do more double tracking.
Right.
But with that double tracking, we'll then have to do the associated works which go with that, which is then of course drainage solutions and all the rest. We are putting cases together for potential future capex spend to Welsh Government, which talks about building a more resilient operational railway, and it touches on those two key points. So it's talking about how do you make it more resilient in terms of double tracking, but also drainage. Touching on our earlier points right at the beginning of the presentation, we do have significant areas which flood, and we need to really try and address and do something about that.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl. Right, another question from Mark. Were there many surveys undertaken, e.g. ground penetrating radar, slip trenches, etc., to determine the locations of S&T cables and other utilities in advance of the excavations being undertaken at the exact foundation sites?
It's a really good question, Mark. So yes, I would say with all these things, was there enough GI done? I don't think you'll ever do enough GI to understand what the ground's doing. But more particularly in terms of S&T, Alliance cables and our third-party stats, that's probably the area where we've been bitten and caught out the most. We've tried undertaking a number of different methods. So we did consider going down the slit trenching method, and again, we had some levels of success with that on the Great Western electrification project. But what we have found on the core valley lines is the amount of real significant stats in holes where all the drawings and all the diagrams we had and all the knowledge we had, root knowledge, is that there just shouldn't have been any stats in the ground. So that certainly made us exceptionally nervous about going down the slit trench method. Now, I recognise we could have taken a risk-based approach of if we affected operational services on the CVL, they're less likely to accrue such significant delayed minutes as it would do on the Great Western Main Line. But what we're more concerned about is some of the significant stats. And just picking up on that, and to reiterate my point before, even that we've had all the stats data come through from the likes of Welsh Water and Wales and Western for gas, we've had some significant discrepancies of where some high pressure, medium pressure, low pressure gas and water mains have been. So we've had to default and dig every single location. Now, we have tried different types of tech, so we have gone out and done the different types of GPR, and it's had mixed effects, to be honest. We've gone out with locations where we've known full well there's been stats there because we've already dug those locations, and GPR didn't pick it up. And then there's other locations it picks certain things up and not others. So for me, I don't think GPR's dead in the ground. There's clearly a case for it. We've used it elsewhere and it has been really helpful. Am I entirely convinced it's the right thing for stats? I'm not yet, but I'm willing to give it another go. If there's other people out there which have had better success, then I'm more than happy to pick up on it. There's another question here. Could you elaborate on the type of earthworks that planned for the embankments and cuttings with regards to stability and climate change? Yeah, that's a really valid question. So we've got two specific areas which are of real concern to us. We've had some significant bank slips of areas which are potentially associated to third-party works or indeed some highway works by the local authority. And I know James and the team are working those through to actually try and get down to the bottom of those. But in terms of what type of works, there's a whole plethora of different types of interventions we're going to have to put in place, down to soil nailing, actually physically regrading and stripping embankments back. We've got a whole host of different types of interventions required, and in terms of the climate change, it's a real challenge. The one thing I'm really keen to do is, of course, our drainage works. We do have a significant amount of culverts. I think off the top of my head, there's at least 250 culverts, albeit I think one of the earlier slides I presented, it's got almost 300 plus assets. But at the moment, the ones which we think we might have to interface is circa 250 culverts. And we've got to make sure that, one, we understand what they're doing, and part of our track works, if we're track lowering, we make sure we interface them in the right way, and we don't necessarily damage them.
Good.
Andrew, question there in terms of blockades. Internal Transport for Wales, as the bus and train operator, must be simpler to arrange and cost out. Is it simple, and how long does it take to arrange? Well, we still have to follow industry timescales in terms of letting the customers know. So there's no change for us there, Andrew. The one challenge I have got around bus replacement services is that or train replacement services, is how effective are we at doing that? I see sort of horror photos of empty coaches and buses sat at Rada station as an interchange point with no one on it, and of course the engines are turning and burning and letting off diesel fumes everywhere. And I always really challenge myself, how effective are our bus replacement services, or train replacement services? I think one of the things we are already starting to look at with our train operator is, given that there are bus stops at every single train station we're using across the piece, is it something we could be a bit leaner and probably a bit cleverer at enhancing the existing bus service, which actually runs across or outside every single bus station? Is it something we should be doing with the bus operator to actually enhance each of the bus stops for those which haven't got shelters, to provide shelters, whether it be temporary or permanent? And should we actually invest the money there, which arguably probably be slightly cheaper than having dozens of coaches running across the network? So we're still a bit early in our thinking about what to do there, but nothing's off the table. But in theory, is it costing us less? No, it's not. We still pay the same Schedule 4 costs, but we are looking at that. There is an opportunity for us to potentially have a slightly leaner way at costing our possessions at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Right, there's a question from Peter Halliwell.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I didn't scroll
do you
down.
know how this railway would be managed from an interoperability perspective? Will it be a mixture of metro or tramway and exclusion?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you're certainly going to be testing me a little bit, Peter. So it is going to be a blend. It is heavy rail, albeit it will be running line of sight from down to Cardiff Bay. There is clearly some interoperability constraints which we're working through at the moment, and it's an application which we're working through with the ORR to be able to do that. I mean, it is the MVs are a tram train, and we certainly want to exploit the technology to be able to run line of sight. Some of the extensions we've been looking at with our development colleagues are actually looking from Cardiff Bay onwards, and indeed some other extensions that are along the northwest corridor, whether that be train or BRT or something slightly different is yet to be decided. But there's something to go at there, and I don't think we've fully exploited the potential of the tram train, but I think running line of sight down to Cardiff Bay is certainly the first step in the right direction. Ed, I know he's had to drop off. I'm going to have to drop off the call. Good. I'm pleased. Hopefully, it's been of use to other people on the call. I'm conscious there's probably one area which I haven't been able to really expand on there, which is with Alan on Queen Street. So we'll look to get something sent out to you all, or to Andrew, and he can send it on to everybody.
Yeah, is it still the intention to carry the service round to Central, sort of through street running, which is one of the ideas that was certainly talked about in the early days when this was done, as a means of creating extra capacity at Central?
I know that's one of the areas still under development, Andy. It's not being baked into the current CBL scope at the moment.
No. Okay. Right.
Alex, question for Alex. You mentioned Great Western route modernisation. It went under quite a few names, didn't it?
Yep.
What's the main learning from that we shall be able to apply here? Wow, there are plenty. Which are the main ones? I think it depends what discipline we look at. If I was to look at OLE, in fact, I'm going to go slightly different. I'm going to look at possessions. Now, this may be slightly more counterintuitive against what I've been asking and talking about in terms of blockade working. As much as everyone would think if you shut the line and go out there and do whole-scale works, it would be more efficient. I'm yet to be convinced that large blockades are really efficient. When you've got multiple disciplines all trying to work in the same area, I think that there's some real learning around what that looks like. If I was to test that slightly further with you, Alex, I come from a track renewals S&C background, and actually when we came into a 27, 29, 54-hour weekend, it seemed to be literally the moment the marker boards are down, the teams are out and they're physically working. And actually, if I looked at my plain line colleagues, and if there's any, I'm sure there'll be lots of S&C folk on the call here, actually the plain line guys were even faster. The marker boards were literally down and they were cutting the track. If I look at all the blockades I've seen on the Great Western electrification, and indeed some of the blockades we've had so far on CVL, I still think we need to become a lot leaner about how we actually utilise every single minute of that blockade and actually really make it efficient. I think our biggest challenge is about how to feed our transient sites. So if I look at OLE, how do we properly feed the machine and keep the not only just foundations but masts and everything flowing? So hopefully that answers your question, Alex.
As ever, these things are all about logistics, aren't they?
But yeah, they certainly are, and it's about getting out of the ground. I mean, the key constraint for me around electrification is trial holes, foundations. But actually, when we get into more of the high output type activities, such as getting the mast up and the SPS and running the wires out, I'm less concerned by that. as soon as I get the foundations in the ground, I'll be able to sleep a little easier than what I am at the moment.
Okay. All right. Have we any more final questions for Karl? Oh, right. Well, I'd like to call upon James Burke to propose a vote of thanks.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Karl, for that. I know I've got a vested interest because it's actually very, very close to home for me. But it's actually great to see some real sort of up to date facts and figures. I think the photographs as well actually speak for themselves. I did work on the Great Western Main Line electrification project, so I can't really actually compare what we are doing on the CVL into that, but I think it's good to see some of those. I think it was the RRVs doing the gully suckers, whereby they actually stuck up the ballast. I don't know if that was used on the Great Western when that was done, was it?
I did a trial down in what was called Route Section 10 at the time, and in fact Dan West will probably remember this because he was with us at the time, and that was around Bridgend, and actually the machine in the right conditions works really well, but it's like everything, and you need to be able to plan and use the machine to its best capability, and like all these things, it's not just a bit of road rail plant and get out there and he tell you what to do. You actually need to engage the supplier to actually get the best out of the machine. We did use it. I'd left NR at this point, but I know the machine was used heavily by Lorraine Curry around Cardiff Central, around that area, and I think it undertook the best part of 70-80 trial holes around that area. So yeah, it works. What you do need to do is just plan it out right to get the most out of the machine.
Yeah. So I think it's actually very, very good to actually see things like that, to actually take away lots of these things whereby you've actually got sort of large machines actually putting a bucket into the sort of ground. And even though I'm not a signaling or a control systems engineer, my heart does actually sink when we've got lots of 40, 50, 60-year-old cables that are paper lined, and just actually seeing people put in shovels and sort of buckets into the sort of ground just actually fills me with dread, really. So I think it's actually good, and I do know that you've got quite a robust bedded services process in sort of place as well. I think that came on one of the questions regarding some of those cables and that, but I think it was actually very, very clear and actually concise, actually how you sort of depict the size and scope of the sort of challenge, because this is a massive challenge. If you think of the CVL curves, you know, the sort of number of curves we've got, and whereas the alignment of the railway, which is sort of already 100 years old, to actually put something very, very modern there, whereby you're going to have the overhead line to be snaking across the railway line, to make sure that the sort of wear is sort of going to be all on the same. It is a massive challenge, and even though the CVL is only, I think it accounts for approximately 10% of the Wales route, the CVL actually takes just over 40% of the train services now. So when you start going to 4 trains per hour from the heads of valleys, and as all of those branches actually merge again into Cardiff Queen Street, once you get up to 18 trains per sort of hour, whereas I'm not at the forefront of the project now, we actually really have to start to think on how on earth we're going to inspect, maintain, examine and test all of the infrastructure from, say, 2 to 3 years time on. So it is a massive challenge, and it was very, very good to bring that sort of challenge back to actually how it's going to be affecting the local people. Having seen all of the photos over the last, probably not so much the last year and a half, but certainly the last probably 3 or 4 years of all the trains being rammed, really, you know, sort of overcrowded. You know, in the next sort of 2 to 3 years sort of time, it's going to be a very, very different story. And I think it's actually good that we sort of do touch on the whole point of this is actually for those local people, you know. But yes, yeah, I'm actually looking forward to it. Looking forward to it actually being handed over to me and my sort of team. But to that end, can I actually ask everybody to put on their microphones? I think I'm doing this correct. I've never done this before.
Yep.
But I've done it on sort of Teams. If you can all come off your mute, please, and can we actually show Karl the vote of thanks that he actually deserves this evening. And Karl, thank you very, very much.
All right.
Thank you. You're very well. Thank you.
Hey.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Karl. Right, just before I close the meeting, I forgot to mention that we've had Andrew put out all the, pardon me, the notes of the last meeting with the newsletter. Are there any issues arising from that? If not, I will take them as a record. Right, next meetings. Our next meeting will be on December the 13th, and it's about the South Wales Test Track, or what will become, hopefully, the Global Centre for Rail Excellence. And we have Arthur Amey and Professor Alan Doherty coming to actually talk about that. Then in January, we have weed spraying and line side control. With Rachel Furness from Network Rail talking about the developments there and what's happening, particularly again in the light of a lot of the challenges we're having with environmental issues. And then in February, we're planning to have a repeat of the first aid session that Rob Natman did for us for some while back. And I said, I think we have to look if we can make that perhaps our first face-to-face get together, because I think that'll make it a much more interesting exercise. Okay. So if there's no more, I'm going to stop the recording.